Ready for the Revelation series to continue? Would you welcome Ben up? Woohoo! Now, Ben, how can we help set you up? Do you need anything?
So, here we go. Yes. I put in another order for these, so I've got a few more copies if anyone wants the hard copy of the Ephesus Scroll book. Margaret, this is yours. All right. Excellent. Well, last week, Adam gave us a glimpse into heaven. There were thrones, worship songs, there was a lamb that looked like it had been slain, and a scroll that only the lamb had the authority to open. Well, this week we get to see what happens when that scroll is opened. Oh, and you may also remember that he had his email address up on screen so that you could email him if you had any questions. That's a great idea. I'm going to do the same. So if you have any questions about what I am going to say today, please email him. All right. Before we get into Revelation chapter 6 and 7, we do need to take a short detour into the Old Testament. In the New Testament, the aspect of God's character that is to the fore is his grace, seen supremely in the death of his Son on the cross as an atoning sacrifice for the sins of the world. In the Old Testament, however, the predominant aspect is arguably God's justice. And that justice is usually expressed as judgment against sin. Well, in the book of Revelation, God's justice is also being emphasised to encourage the struggling Christian church. In order to encourage them, John actually wants to show that the non-Christian world will be judged. So it's not surprising that then John uses a lot of Old Testament judgment language. At times, he makes partial quotations or allusions to Old Testament texts, and at other times, he just uses the traditional means of judgment, references to war, famine, plague, earthquakes, and cosmic destruction. Well, there are some paradigmatic examples that we could look at if we had more time. Oops, pointing the wrong way. There we go. The flood. Now, if we remember when Jesus is predicting the destruction of Jerusalem, so he in Mark 13, Matthew 24, he refers to as it was in the time of Noah. So the flood was a thing that they reference. We also have the plagues on Egypt. A lot of the destruction that will come up in the book of Revelation references or echoes the plagues of Egypt. And then there are the curses for disobedience that Deuteronomy 28 and 32 reference. It always makes me sort of chuckle, I guess, at the way that Deuteronomy passage, where the emphasis lies. So if you remember, Moses says, there are blessings here if you follow the law and do the right thing, and that takes about half a chapter. And then he says, and these are the curses that will happen if you don't. And they go for 2 or 3 chapters. There's a lot of stuff, mainly to do with exile, that comes up in that. But we don't have time for any of that. Instead, I want to look at something called the Day of the Lord, and particularly the language of cosmic destruction that goes along with it. So here's a passage from Isaiah 13. See, the day of the Lord is coming, a cruel day with wrath and fierce anger, to make the land desolate and destroy the sinners within it. The stars of heaven and their constellations will not show their light. The rising sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give its light. I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their sins. I will put an end to the arrogance of the haughty and will humble the pride of the ruthless. I will make people scarcer than pure gold, more rare than the gold of Ophir. Therefore, I will make the heavens tremble and the earth will shake from its place at the wrath of the Lord Almighty in the day of his burning anger. This passage is part of a prophecy against Babylon. And just a few verses earlier, we find that Isaiah is talking about an army that God is going to raise up to punish Babylon for what they did to Israel. Listen, a noise on the mountains like that of a great multitude. Listen, an uproar among the kingdoms like nations massing together. The Lord Almighty is mustering an army for war. They come from faraway lands, from the ends of the heavens, the Lord and the weapons of his wrath to destroy the whole country. And we know from history that Babylon was overthrown by the Persians. However, when the Persians defeated the Babylonians, the sun, the moon, and the stars were not destroyed. Rather, this language of cosmic chaos is being used to show how significant this moment is. The cosmic destruction in the heavens symbolizes that God is indeed using the Persians as his instrument of judgment upon Babylon, which is taking place on the earth. We can see a similar thing happening in Jeremiah. I looked at the earth and it was formless and empty, and at the heavens and their light was gone. I looked at the mountains and they were quaking, all the hills were swaying. I looked and there were no people, every bird in the sky had flown away. I looked and the fruitful land was a desert. All its towns lay in ruins before the Lord, before his fierce anger. Well, this is even stronger language than the Isaiah passage. The reference to formless and empty deliberately alludes to Genesis 1, verse 2, when the world was formless and empty. And so Jeremiah is describing an uncreation, a reversal of creation in a way. It's a return to that pre-creation chaos. And again, the wider context is about judgment coming upon a nation. This time the nation is the southern kingdom of Judah, Jerusalem, at the hands, again, of another army. Is it up there? Yep. Tell this to the nations, proclaim concerning Jerusalem, a besieging army is coming from a distant land, raising a war cry against the cities of Judah. Now, if you remember your story of Jeremiah, you'll know that he was worried about his message not coming true. Because if the things that he had prophesied did not eventuate, then he would be labelled a false prophet. So this passage, you deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived. You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long. I hear many whispering, terror on every side. Denounce him. Let's denounce him. All my friends are waiting for me to slip, saying, perhaps he will be deceived. Then we will prevail over him and take our revenge on him. All right, so he's really worried about being labelled a false prophet if Jerusalem isn't destroyed. And yet, when Jerusalem is destroyed by the Babylonians, Jeremiah's enemies did not denounce him as a false prophet because the sun, the moon, and the stars were still shining. The uncreation that he talked about didn't happen literally. So these passages, I think, from the Old Testament demonstrate that this over-the-top judgment language was not meant literally, and everyone knew that. Rather, this end-of-the-world language was being used metaphorically, like when we say that something significant happened, that it was an earth-shattering event. It's not that the earth is literally shattered, it's just saying how significant that event is. Now, some people worry about the word metaphorical. They sort of think metaphorical means it's not happening or something. But metaphorical does not mean abstract. There is still a real, concrete event that's being referred to. That is the army attacking Jerusalem, or Babylon, as the case may be. The metaphorical language is being used to show how significant this event is. It's like the on earth as it is in heaven, the idea. If things are happening in the heavens, that shows how significant the things that are happening on earth are. All right, now there are lots of other Old Testament passages that we could look at, but we have to get into Revelation now. I'm assuming that you've read Revelation 6 and 7. If you haven't, now you've got homework. And then, of course, for next week, because I'm preaching again, I'm expecting that you will have read chapters 8 to 10. All right? We're not going to have enough time to read through the passage, unfortunately. Anyway, if you've looked at Revelation, you can't help but notice all of the sevens that are referenced. It's a very, very important number in this book. Back in chapters 1 to 3, there were 7 lampstands, there were 7 stars, 7 churches. Last week in chapters 4 and 5, there are 7 flaming torches, and the Lamb had 7 horns and 7 eyes, which represent, the text tells us, the 7 spirits of God sent out into all the world. And as Adam said, he didn't really know what that means. I don't really know what that means either. All right, the 7 is like a completeness number. And then, as a bit of a head into the future, 6 is a diminishing of the perfect number 7. So when we get to 666, that's a diminishment of the perfect number 7. All right, but in this book, there are 3 main 7s, 3 groups of 7. We have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, and later on we'll have 7 bowls. And the reason these are important is because these 7s have a structural role in the book. But when you read these chapters, you'll find there are other numbers that are being referred to, other numbers within the 7s. So we will need to pay attention to that. Well, as we established last week, only the Lamb is able to open the seals that are holding the scroll closed. Well, when the first 4 seals are opened, each one reveals a rider on a horse. And these are the very famous 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, traditionally named war, famine, pestilence, and death. But interestingly, only the 4th one is given a name in the text. The text just describes the first rider as a conqueror, the second as one who brings war, and the third as one who brings famine. Then in verse 8, we get a bit of a summary statement that says that they were given authority to kill by the sword, famine, disease, and wild animals. So that's where pestilence gets his name from, the disease in verse 8. But none of them get named wild animal. I don't know, that just doesn't seem to enter into it. What is very interesting, though, in this section, these 4 riders, it's that they are limited in what they are able to do. So in verse 6, the 3rd rider, famine, is told to make wheat and barley scarce, but not to damage the oil and the wine. Now, seems rather bizarre and maybe random, but it's not. It's because it's a significant limitation on famine. Because wheat and barley are crops that if you destroy a crop one year, you'll grow it again the next year. All right? As long as you've got seed, you can plant it, it'll grow again. But if you destroy vineyards, or even worse, olive trees, they take years before you can get another crop. So famine has been limited here. And then verse 8, again, that summary verse, says that all 4 are given power over a quarter of the earth. There's one of those numbers that pops up in these 7s, a quarter. Okay, that might sound like a lot, but let's just pop a pin in that number and we'll come back to it later. The 5th seal reveals Christian martyrs who are told to wait because there are more martyrdoms to come. Okay, not very encouraging, really, is it? But, well, let's wait and see. Oh, talking about martyrs, Vera sent in this painting, which was the martyrs before the throne. So thank you. It's very evocative. Well, the 6th seal ushers in a whole bunch of Old Testament allusions involving end-of-the-world language. This is why we took that detour into the Old Testament. I'll read it out. I watched as he opened the sixth seal. There was a great earthquake. The sun turned black like sackcloth made of goat hair. The whole moon turned blood red, and the stars in the sky fell to earth as figs drop from a fig tree when shaken by a strong wind. The heavens receded like a scroll being rolled up, and every mountain and island was removed from its place. Then the kings of the earth, the princes, the generals, the rich, the mighty, and everyone else, both slave and free, hid in caves and among the rocks of the mountains. They called to the mountains and the rocks, "Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come, and who can withstand it?" So, lots of Old Testament allusions here. One of the funny things I find is when I'm reading the Old Testament, particularly the prophets, I keep finding all these phrases that I remember from Revelation. All right, like this hiding in caves, the reference to "fall on us, mountains." You know, these are all just quotes almost from the Old Testament. But there's that final question there. Just a picture of the top one's the fifth seal, and then the bottom one's the sixth, with all the bad things happening and the people hiding in caves. But that last question, who can withstand the day of the Lord? That's a very good question. And then Revelation 7 gives us the answer. They are the people who bear the seal of God, namely God's servants, the Christians. And then the seventh seal isn't opened until verse 1 of chapter 8. And then we get something of an anticlimax, 30 minutes of silence. And then it immediately goes into the seven trumpets, which we will look at in more detail next week. Suffice to say, when the trumpets are sounded, things get a little worse. Instead of a quarter of the earth, nasty things happen to a third of the earth. And then if we keep looking forward to Revelation 16, we get the bowls of God's wrath. And the destruction at that point is total, 100%. But I think this gives us a bit of a clue as to how these sevens are supposed to be understood. It's only that last group of seven, the seven bowls of God's wrath, that is supposed to be seen as God's punishment. The seven seals and the seven trumpets is not God's punishment. So the big question then is, how are these groups of seven related? Well, there are a number of different options. One of them, are they chronological? All right, did John expect that the end of the world would be preceded by successive waves of earthly disaster of increasing magnitude? Well, it's hard to argue that it's chronological because there are things that we're going to come across in the next few chapters that are not in chronological order, such as in chapter 12, we're going to read about the birth of the Messiah. And then in chapter 13, the description of the beast, I think it's from the beast from the sea, it says that 5 of the 7 heads are from kings already dead. So there's history here still to come. So, chronological, one option doesn't really fit the text. Others have argued for a concertina chronology, but if you know anything about fractals, fractal chronology would be better. And if you don't know anything about fractals, I apologize. I just like fractals. But the point is, maybe the 7 trumpets occur during the period that's covered by the 7 seals, and then the 7 bowls occurs sort of within the period covered by the 7 trumpets. The idea is that, John is focusing more and more in on the end. So we get the 7 seals, then he gives us the 7 trumpets, all fitting into that bit, and then if you go in even further, once you get to the 7th trumpet, you get all the 7 bowls, all right? Sort of getting smaller and smaller, but focusing in. It's possible that that's what he has in mind, but it actually still doesn't get out of the problem of those non-chronological elements that I mentioned before. So, what is another alternative? Well, artistic. An artistic presentation. This is a great quote that comes out of G.B. Caird's commentary. John is like an expert guide in an art gallery, lecturing to students about a vast mural. First, he makes them stand back to absorb a general impression. Then he takes them close to study the details. In John's symbolic language, 7 is the number of completeness, and the sevenfold visions, seals, trumpets, and bowls, are his general views of the totality of divine judgment. Then, in between the 7s, the unnumbered visions are his close-ups, his studies of detail. Well, I think this fits because, as Adam said last week, the scroll contains God's redemptive plan of salvation, in which he will assert his sovereignty over a sinful world and achieve the purpose of creation. So this means John will be shown not just future events, but the whole operation of this plan, from its beginnings in the cross to its triumphal conclusion, culmination, in the new heavens and the new earth. And remember those numbers, that progression from a quarter to a third to a whole. That's significant too, and we'll get to the trumpets next week. And I'll explain what I think is going on with those numbers. But for now, just think about what was revealed as those seals were opened. All right, we had war, famine, pestilence, death, earthquakes, cosmic language chaos stuff, martyrdoms, all right, all of that. Then try to imagine what it would be like if you were in the first century, and then how would the early church receive this vision? I think it's actually really interesting that in the last 4 decades of the first century, the following disasters occurred. There was some serious earthquakes in AD 60. In AD 62, the Roman army suffered a humiliating defeat on the eastern frontier at the hands of the Parthians. More specifically, fitting the church, there was persecution of Christians that followed the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. Then, after Nero suicided in 68 AD, there was a year of political chaos and battles as 4 rival claimants to the throne battled it out. Then, from 66 to 70 AD, there was the 4-year horror of the Jewish war that ended with Jerusalem in ruins. Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 AD that actually created a pall of darkness so widespread that people feared that was the end of the world. And then in 92 AD, there was a really serious grain famine. So, wars and famines, various sicknesses navigated without vaccines and medications, and volcanoes to boot. If you had lived through all of that, what would you have made of the events accompanying the 7 seals? Well, my personal thought is that you would think that sounds like everyday life. Everyday life. I think we in the West have had it easy. Well, not so much recently, right? We've had a pandemic, and now there's this terrible war in the Ukraine. The planet is getting hotter and wilder. There's a talk about grain shortages. I think we're learning that a stable, peaceful, healthy existence is actually not normal, especially if we think about what the rest of history was like. So, John is trying to encourage that struggling, persecuted church living around about the 90s in that first century that all of those terrible, life-threatening events are all part of God's divine plan of salvation, even the martyrdoms that they were facing. So basically, John's vision of the seven seals is intended to assert Christ's sovereignty over a world that involves conquest, war, famine, death, and even martyrdom. All right, well, we need to look at chapter 7 now too. Just a quick squiz. This chapter 7 is a great example of something that happens a few times in the book of Revelation. And we had it happen last week. There is a significant difference between what John hears and what he sees. If you think back to Revelation 5, John hears one of the elders say, the lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. Well, these are all Old Testament references to the Messiah. But then what does John see? He doesn't see a lion, he sees a lamb looking as if it's been slain. Well, in Revelation 7, we get another example of this. John hears someone talking about putting a seal on the foreheads of God's servants, and then he hears a census involving the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each, leading to a total of 144,000. There are passages like this, censuses like this, in the Old Testament. Chronicles has a few, as an example. Now, this 144,000, that figure, the Jehovah's Witnesses take that quite literally, that number, quite literally. But they're missing what's going on here. Because what John has heard is an Old Testament census. But then he sees an uncountable multitude of Christian martyrs from every nation, tribe, people, and language, singing songs with lyrics, very much like a couple of the songs we sang today. Thanks, Trav. So what's going on with this hearing-sight mismatch? Well, here's Caird again. I like Caird, in case you hadn't noticed. In John's vision of the heavenly council, he heard a voice speak of the Lion of Judah, and when he looked to see this lion, he in fact saw a lamb. The scriptural image had been transformed by the historic fact. So in the present passage, Revelation 7, what John hears is the scriptural image of the army of Israel. But what he sees is the Christian fact of the noble army of martyrs. So again, John is hearing Old Testament references, but then he sees how these Old Testament references have been reinterpreted in the light of Jesus' death and resurrection. Think about it. The Jews had been expecting their Messiah to be like a roaring lion who would come in and destroy the Romans through the application of violence and judgment. That was their expectation. But Jesus did not fit this expectation. While he accepted the title of Messiah, he then subverted those expectations, dying the death of a failed Messiah. He was ignominiously crucified by the very Romans he was supposed to be destroying. So the Lion of Judah has become the lamb that was slain. And yet, Jesus' resurrection was a vindication that this was God's plan all along. Now, similarly, in this chapter, chapter 7, the 12 tribes of Israel, which was essentially a closed and limited group, has been thrown open to all. People from every nation, tribe, people, and language group, all able to come into the family. And then the chapter ends with a little glimpse of the ultimate end that we will find out a lot more about when we get to Revelation 21 and 22. So they are before the throne of God. This is the Christian martyrs. They are before the throne of God and serve him day and night in his temple. And he who sits on the throne will shelter them with his presence. Never again will they hunger, never again will they thirst. The sun will not beat down on them, nor any scorching heat. For the Lamb at the centre of the throne will be their shepherd. He will lead them to springs of living water, and God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. And look at all these Old Testament quotes again. Isaiah 49:10 and Isaiah 25:8. So once again, we see that John is encouraging the church. Martyrdom is inevitable. It's a result of one's faith in Jesus. It's inevitable. It's part of normal life. And it certainly was in the first century, with Nero blaming the Christians of Rome for the Great Fire in 64 AD. And there is evidence of wider spread persecution under Domitian in the 90s AD, during the very period in which the book of Revelation was most likely written. And then things get really bad under Diocletian, and really bad. And of course, martyrdoms are still occurring today. Sometimes I think I hear the quote that there are more martyrdoms now than there has ever been. But the message of Revelation is this: even if the worst was to happen and you lost your life because of your faith in Jesus, then you have eternal life in the new heavens and the new earth to look forward to. So, persevere. Remember that God is in control. Jesus has authority over all of this. And as we'll soon find out, there's actually something really, really mysterious going on and somewhat paradoxical about those Christian martyrdoms. But you're going to have to wait for a later chapter for that to be revealed. So, let's finish with some discussion questions. So we'll get you to, break up into small areas nearby. So just as I did earlier, try to imagine what life would have been like for those first century Christians, living with all those earthquakes, wars, famines, plagues, wild animals, and on top of all of that, persecution. Would you struggle to believe that God was in control? I think I might. And then how does Jesus' authority, a direct result of his death and resurrection, how does that fit in? And if anyone has any questions for me, I'm not putting my email up. Not the best way to deal with questions. Just put your hand up and I'll come over like a good teacher, all right? So if in your little small group you've got a question for me, just stick your hand up nice and loud, high. And how long? About 5 or so minutes, we'll see. All right, thanks everyone.